Okay, hello everyone. My name is Chris Saladin, and I am the social media coordinator for the American Society of Church History. Today, I'm interviewing Christopher Bonura, who is a recent PhD recipient from the University of California, Berkeley, and is currently a postdoc at the University of Toronto at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies. And Chris was the recipient of our 2020 Mead Prize, which is for a paper coming out of a dissertation. I think that's technically the description of the prize. And the title of that paper was Eusebius of Caesarea, the Roman Empire, and the Fulfillment of Biblical Prophecy, Reassessing Byzantine Imperial Eschatology in the Age of Constantine. And this article will be appearing in our upcoming September issue of Church History. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks.
So just to start things off, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you end up studying what you do?
I went to the University of Florida for my undergraduate degree, and there I got interested in late antique and medieval history, and decided to pursue a PhD, and ended up going to UC Berkeley and studying Byzantine history. And there I became interested in Byzantine apocalypticism and eschatology, essentially apocalyptic literature about the end of the world, and more broadly, what did people in Byzantium, what did people in the late antique world think was going to happen at the end of time? And ended up writing a PhD dissertation. My initial idea for a PhD dissertation was on a specific text called The Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, which is a project I'm pursuing right now in my postdoc position. But one thing I decided I really needed to figure out in my PhD dissertation, my research, is to sort of wade through the existing historiography and make sense of where this particular apocalypse fit into this bigger genre and larger questions of eschatology. And that led me to dealing with some of the assumptions and what I perceived as problems in that historiography that I was trying to work through. And so the piece that I decided to publish separately with church history that we're discussing today was the result of that. Engaging a very fraught historical question of what did Eusebius, one of these extremely important figures of Byzantine history, right? One of the important figures in the reign of Constantine, in the shift to the Christian empire. How did he perceive what would happen at the end of time?
Yeah, very interesting. So it sounds like you've already kind of sort of moving into the article specifically. If you had to summarize the article and sort of your main argument within it, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as arguing that, contrary to widely repeated assertions throughout modern scholarship, Eusebius did not proclaim that the Christian Roman Empire had become the kingdom of saints prophesied in the book of Daniel, or the kingdom of heaven on earth, or the earthly millennium, all ideas that are falsely ascribed to him. And so we should stop treating him as a sort of founding father of so-called Byzantine imperial eschatology, and sort of then opening the door to deal with the question of, well, what is Byzantine eschatology itself? This sort of eschatology that Eusebius is treated as the starting point of, right? So it's a larger question I dealt with in my dissertation, but I wanted to put this out here as a starting point to deal with this question.
Gotcha. That's really interesting. So I guess a couple questions. I'm particularly curious about are first, if you don't sort of ascribe those things, the sort of origins of this very Byzantine imperial eschatology to Eusebius, where do you see that sort of originating, which I'm sure is maybe the entire point of your dissertation? Or is it more that there isn't just one clear origin, that maybe that is a flawed way of looking at this? What would you, sort of where does this article take you as sort of a next step?
Yeah, absolutely. So where I'm going with this is questioning the very concept of a specifically Byzantine imperial eschatology, that the Byzantines thought of the end of the world as significantly different ways than any other Christians. Now, that's not to dispute that there were specifically Byzantine inflections about how they thought about the end of the world, right? Texts about the end of the world that were popular in Byzantium that weren't popular elsewhere. But there is this larger sense in the historiography that in Byzantium, eschatology, apocalypticism was largely used to uphold, to justify, to glorify the state. Some scholars who are being most direct in their characterizations call it propaganda, and I want to move beyond that because apocalypticism, eschatology has many social functions, right? And it's when we just chalk it down to something that's being used to uphold the power of the state, I think that's grossly simplifying what's going on. And perhaps if you want, we could pursue this into what I think is going on, which is there is this tend to orientalize Byzantium, right? I mean, part of my problem with the very idea of Byzantine imperial eschatology is what does that even mean, right? We talk about Byzantine eschatology. There are books, called things like Byzantine imperial eschatology. But why is it Byzantine? Why don't we have Roman imperial eschatology, right? But this is all coming out of this very old historiographic tradition and trend to see the East as different, right? The East as almost aberrant, where Christianity in the East is subordinated to the needs of the state. Whereas in the West, you have this very heroic, you have this heroic narrative of Western history where Augustine comes along and frees everyone from, this concatenation of Christianity in the state. And I'm very suspicious of that narrative, right?
Yeah, so you got exactly kind of where I was wanted to go with sort of another follow-up question, which was the problem of using that label Byzantium here.
Right.
And I was curious, particularly because you're talking about Eusebius, you're talking in a 4th century context in this article, why apply the term Byzantine to this eschatology versus Roman or something else, which I think you just kind of got there. But I found that particularly, I was curious why ascribe this as Byzantine eschatology in this case.
Right. I think the terminology we use is problematic, and perhaps it is time to move beyond that terminology. I continue to use it here because I'm trying to sort of meet the historiography where it's at, right? Eusebius is always put as this figure at the beginning of a so-called Byzantine eschatology, a Byzantine way of looking at the end of the world. That perhaps comes out of this larger sense that in the East, in the Greek-speaking areas of the empire, the areas where people are writing in Greek, right? That something different is going on. And again, I see that as fairly unconvincing to me, right? If we want to look at someone who really has an extremely positive assessment of the empire's role in history with some who also gestures at the book of Daniel and a little bit of eschatology. That's a Rosius, who's a Westerner, right? And an intimate of Augustine, right? So this basic Eastern-Western breakdown of things doesn't really work in the way people want it to work. Or I think today, people generally are going to, today people realize that that this divide between East and West is quite artificial. But the problem is paradigms that originate in older scholarship have survived, right? And so people keep reproducing those paradigms without questioning them. Even though if you take a step back, it's pretty clear why this idea of the East as being different is so problematic and is wrapped up again in these orientalizing ideas about a basic distinction between Easterners and Westerners, and how they think about politics and religion, and as a result of that, what will be the political ramifications of the end of time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good summary of a lot of the problems that sort of I've thought myself with some of the divides we put up by continuing to use the terms Byzantine and other things like that. I mean, I find in my own research that I'm on the fence of whether to even use terms like that or to try something else, but I often find myself having to engage with that paradigm the way that you yourself just said you have to, even when you're trying to directly challenge it in so many ways.
I mean, there is a move now I've found to get away from the term Byzantine and use terms like the medieval Roman Empire, right? I mean, the problem with that term is there's a dispute in the Middle Ages as to whose empire is the Roman Empire. So we can say that the Eastern Roman Empire, but that's a mouthful. So we all know that the people who lived in the Eastern Roman Empire, didn't call themselves Byzantines by and large. Obviously called Constantinople in classicizing ways Byzantium, but really the idea of a Byzantine Empire, right, is a outgrowth of early modern German scholars. But it's a convenient way of talking about this entity which is different, right, from the empire of Theodosius II or Justinian is a very different place from the empire of Augustus, right? And so I think that's a motivating cause for using this terminology. And then the empire of, say, of Constantine Porphyrogenitus or Constantine the 11th at the end, right, are equally different places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or equally quite different.
Mm-hmm. So let's move a little more to, let's move on to kind of some other questions here. So one thing that, given that the article you're talking that kind of this conversation is coming out of was drawing on your wider dissertation research, I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit to the sort of process of sort of adapting a article from adapting a dissertation chapter or part of a dissertation into an article. And then I also know that you are currently working on a monograph, and sort of then what is that process also, sort of the difference between sort of moving more focused in a way from the dissertation, or I guess moving out with an article, and then sort of also what seems like something very different moving to a monograph.
So producing the article from the dissertation was a pretty straightforward process, because the article that we're talking about started out as a dissertation chapter, sort of one of the early dissertation chapters that set the stage for the argument I was making, which was, again, questioning the notion of Byzantine imperial eschatology. If we define that as the idea that eschatology's primary role in Byzantium was to uphold the needs of the state or the ruling elite, right? And to move beyond that and see that apocalypticism and eschatology could serve an array of other possible social functions, and that we should, not be stuck in this paradigm of imperial eschatology. And so dealing with Eusebius as this sort of or figure in Byzantine eschatological thought. He's also often treated as the origin point of Byzantine political thought more generally, which I am less qualified to talk about or argue in detail about, but I have my own doubts about that as well. Now, in terms of the monograph I'm working on, which is a monograph on a completely different text, completely different author, completely different language. So I'm working on a monograph on the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, which is also coming out of my dissertation, because this ended up being a very important source in the argument I was making, because the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius is a source an apocalyptic source, a source about the end of the world. So dealing with eschatology, what's going to happen at the end of time. But in this case, does take a very, very positive view of the role of the Roman Empire in history and the consummation of history. But in this case, it's not Byzantine, right? It's a text written in Syriac in the Umayyad Caliphate, so not even in the Byzantine Empire, probably not even in lands that had been part of Byzantium before the Arab invasions, right? So they're probably in a place that had been part of the Sasanian Persian Empire. So what's going on that this quite positive view of the Roman Empire's historical role is actually coming from outside the empire, but that's a completely different subject. But in terms of adapting things from the dissertation, I guess there are a number of pieces that sort of function together for the larger argument about Byzantine eschatology, and what I've been trying to do is sort of tease out those things. In part because my dissertation was very long, and I don't think anybody wants to read the whole thing in one go. So tease out these larger pieces and see where they lead us.
No, it sounds like your current work that's interesting how you're sort of moving from just one part of the dissertation and taking that somewhere new in a lot of ways, following some of your same lines of thought, but versus just taking that whole big dissertation and trying to condense it down. That makes sense, that these are kind of, they were necessary projects to do together, but for a dissertation, but maybe they do take you somewhere different ultimately. So I guess just turning to a couple other questions, kind of a fun one. Did your research take you anywhere unexpected or exciting, either in terms of travel or research, or even just to topics you didn't expect to go to?
Yeah, so in terms of actual physical travel, it took me to a number of manuscript libraries. Sort of the sad thing about being a pre-modern historian is you don't get to visit archives often the same way our modernist colleagues do. But especially in dealing with late era Byzantine eschatology, because I was interested in following up a lot of these things through the end of the Byzantine Empire into the post-Byzantine period, in part because that's where a lot of our surviving manuscripts come from. We have very few manuscripts, especially of apocalyptic material, that date to the Byzantine period. So much of what we know about apocalypses, which I'll bracket out as their own thing here, which are narrative texts about narrative texts that are styled as revelations from God, that either provide information about the next life, individual eschatology, right? The fate of the soul, what happens in heaven, what happens in hell, or other hidden things like what's going to happen at the end of time, which is what I'm interested in the dissertation project, right? So those types of apocalypses mainly survive in post-Byzantine sources. So that's something kind of unexpected that I came to through this, that, on a conceptual level that are quite interesting, and I hope to do future work on them. But then tracking some of these down to the manuscript libraries. So for example, I went to the Marciana library in Venice, and looked at a few manuscripts with apocalypses in them. Some of them quite beautifully illustrated. And so it's both an adventure and was extremely rewarding once I got to see these.
Yeah, that sounds like a really awesome experience. I mean, I feel your pain of not having archives to travel to. As a Roman historian, there's very little in terms of that. Of course, there's lots of archaeological sites, but that's a completely different deal in so many ways. So I'm in many ways envious of your ability to travel to manuscript libraries that prove to have materials that that you could work with. That's exciting.
And more libraries are putting their manuscripts online, digitizing them and putting them online, which is great. So, hopefully one day it will become unnecessary to have to go to these places, that we'll be able to access and see these manuscripts, in full color, high resolution detail without having to, leave our homes and offices. But, and that day is rapidly approaching, but it's going to be a little sad because, there is something about actually going to a place and not only find what you're looking for, but what's next to it, what's near it, or opening up the catalog and saying, oh, that looks interesting. Well, I've got an hour. Let me, can you pull that out and let me take a look at it?
Yeah, for sure. That definitely is an element that'll be missing with that. So kind of one last question to wrap things up here. Most of the readers of our journal are not specialists in late antiquity or don't work with early Christianity in any form. Since we are a journal that covers so much, such a wide range of Christian history. But if you had to recommend one or two books or kind of key articles to introduce someone who knows very little about the field, either to sort of late antiquity more broadly or to eschatology, sort of in the early Christian period, what would those be? Like, what are some either scholars' work that jumps out to you or particular articles or books?
So for the period of late antiquity in general, I'd say the book that got me into it and is quite a few decades old now, but a classic is Peter Brown's The World of Late Antiquity. Now, on the topic of eschatology, there's a lot in terms of a book that does some interesting things with eschatology and the idea of time in the ancient world. Isn't in the late antique period, but this recent book, Time and Its Adversaries, by Paul Kosmin.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
That that deals with the Hellenistic period, raises some really interesting questions about where the concepts of, or you know, how these ideas about the end of time develop, and what they could be reacting to, and treats the relationship between eschatology and empire, I think, in a sensitive and nuanced way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've started reading Cosman's work, and I've read his other work, Land of the Elephant Kings, and both are excellent and super fascinating. So I'm happy that you mentioned that one. That's a good one. Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I won't take up any more of your time, but thank you for joining us.
Well, no problem. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was really great to hear from you. So to anyone listening, thank you for watching. Bye.